Worker misclassification is a huge problem. Who's exempt? Who should get overtime? Misclassification is an increasing risk to your company. Find out what you need to know in today's eESI podcast. Welcome to today's eESI podcast. Our subject, exempt versus non-exempt workers. How important classification really is. Our special guest, Miranda Wooten. Miranda is an HR business partner here at eESI. She has 8+ years of experience specializing in small to mid-sized organizations, providing guidance to all levels of the organizations themselves. And her experience includes things like benefits, employee relations, payroll, performance management, policy design, talent acquisitions. Miranda has many different specialties, but she's an expert in this area. Miranda, welcome to today's podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, let's talk about exempt versus non-exempt workers. What do you think are the three most important points for listeners to understand about this issue?
So I think the three most important points would be, first, the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees, which employees are eligible for the exemption status, and then finally, independent contractors.
Let's talk first about the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees. What is the criteria for proper classification?
Yeah, so if an employee is considered exempt, their employer is not required to pay them overtime. And then if an employee is considered non-exempt, they are entitled to overtime pay. So in addition to the employer not having to pay them overtime, the Department of Labor has created 5 categories that exempt employees must fall into. And those are executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, and computer related. And within each of those categories, there's job duties that those employees must meet to be classified as an exempt employee.
Their job description must fit one of those 5 criteria in order to be exempt from overtime. There's also a salary minimum. What is that salary minimum?
Yes, that salary minimum is $455 a week.
An employee must make $455 a week also to be considered an exempt employee, but they also have to meet the other criteria we discussed. Let's talk about independent contractors. This is a big one. I understand that the fines and penalties for misclassifying independent contractors or employees as independent contractors, which some companies will do simply to save money and to save on having to pay for Social Security or for certain taxes, is stiff.
So it definitely can range based off of how extreme this misclassification is. One particular case was a case in Arizona involving home builders, and they were ordered to pay $48,000 in back wages and penalties for misclassifying workers as independent contractors.
$48,000, of which significant portion of that was fines, and I've heard of companies having to pay even more than that. So misclassifying a worker as an independent contractor, when you're trying to save a few dollars, can cost you significantly more. What are some of the criteria that separate an independent contractor from an employee?
I think as an employer, you should look at how much control you have over this worker. So for instance, are you training this worker? Are you evaluating this worker? I think those are some key things to determine if this is an employee or an independent contractor. Also, how is this worker getting paid? Typically, an employee would make either an hourly or salary rate, whereas an independent contractor would be paid a flat fee for their services.
Okay, so control, perhaps who decides how the job is done, whether they're paid hourly or a flat fee. These are all, and there are more, criteria for deciding whether a worker is classified correctly. It's a very important thing for employers to know and to do accurately. Are there any final comments you'd like to make that might be helpful to our listeners?
The Department of Labor has created some great fact sheets on these topics, and I think it's a good resource for employers to review. It documents those 5 categories that we mentioned before and what those job duties are for employees to be able to qualify to be exempt. And the Department of Labor has also put out the information they need to determine if it's an employee or independent contractor.
And you've been kind enough to provide that to us so that we can make that freely available to our listeners. Well, Miranda, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Miranda Wooten, a HR business partner at eESI, and she has shared some details on how to tell if your workers are exempt or non-exempt according to criteria established by the Department of Labor. A very important issue. Well, thank you for listening to this podcast today, part of our goal at eESI of helping you simplify business.